Hello and welcome to the Admech series, where we go from your first purchase to your first 2000 point army list and everything in between for the forces of the Adeptus Mechanicus, also known as the Admech. In this video, we'll be taking a look at the heavy support choices for the Adeptus Mechanicus, and while Admech does feel like an army that is very heavy support choice heavy, it's actually one that only has 3 choices, but the feeling of it being such a heavy support army is because it's very mechanical and has a lot of large units in a lot of different unit types. So that being said, it's actually interesting to see how few choices they have, but how many appearances those choices have made throughout time, and what the army feels like despite the realities of what they actually have access to. We're going to start by looking at the most common choice, known as the Skorpius Disintegrator. The Skorpius Disintegrator comes in at 145 points, and now has the same cost, regardless of which weapons you choose to arm it with. And for the stat line of the Skorpius Disintegrator, it doesn't have a particularly bad one, with a 12-inch movement speed, a 3+ ballistic skill that does degrade as the unit gets bracketed, all the way down to a 5+ ballistic skill, a toughness of 7, making it reasonably durable, and 12 wounds, which helps with the durability. However, it only has a 3+ normal save, and does not have an invulnerable save. Though, with that being said, it can get a feel no pain save against mortal wounds using the benevolence of the Omnissiah Stratagem for 1 command point. This can definitely help it survive against some mortal wounds, as mortal wounds do become more and more prevalent within the meta. In addition to all that, it does have some basic keywords, such as having access to doctrinas, as well as having a broad spectrum data tether, which simply gives it the data tether ability, as well as allowing it to give 1 friendly Skitarii core unit within range the data tether buff, which is always nice because sometimes you don't want to spend the points on a data tether itself, and considering the data tethers in the Skitarii units have gone up in points, it definitely makes these broad spectrum data tethers a lot more useful, as all of a sudden you can save some points across different units. In terms of weapon systems, the Skorpius Disintegrator comes with 2 weapons baseline, being an array of 3 Cognis Heavy Stubbers, giving it a total of 12 shots at a 36-inch range, and having that bolter profile of 4 strength and 1 damage with no armor penetration. This is not the worst option to have, but it's definitely an additional throw-in and does not really stand out, aside from the fact that the majority of the other weapon systems that the Skorpius Disintegrator has access to are blast weapons, meaning that if it gets into combat, the Cognis Heavy Stubbers are pretty much its main way of shooting out of that combat in order to go on and shoot in range again. Then after the Cognis Heavy Stubbers, every loadout of the Skorpius Disintegrator comes armed with a Disruptor Missile Launcher. The Disruptor Missile Launcher has a similar range of 36 inches and has D6 heavy shots, meaning that on average you're going to be generating between 3 and 4 shots at a strength of 7, 2 armor penetration, and D3 damage. This is a blast weapon as mentioned before, but it's one that is reasonably heavy hitting, and the damage profile does make it appealing considering it's an additional weapon that comes on every single loadout. In addition to these standard issue weapons, the Skorpius Disintegrator has 2 options that it can choose for its primary weapon systems. The first of those options is pretty much why you would take a Skorpius Disintegrator within an army list to begin with, that option being the Belarus Energy Cannon. And the Belarus Energy Cannon has a 36-inch range, just like all of the previously mentioned weapon systems, with heavy 3d3 shots, meaning that on average you're going to be getting 6 shots and having the potential to go up to as many as 9 shots. That being said, your minimum is 3 shots, which is also a nice benefit, helping out some of those averages a little bit more. This weapon saw a bit of a reduction in power, going down to 5 strength, 1 armor penetration, and 2 damage a shot. Once again, this is a blast weapon, but it does have one very special rule that makes it such a powerful option. That special rule being that it can ignore line of sight when shooting at a target. This is actually a very powerful ability that no other unit within the Admech offers to the army. There are ways of helping your line of sight with things like flyers or even deep striking or teleporting units. However, this is the only option that directly says that it ignores line of sight, and this is pretty much why you see so many of the Skorpius tanks within Admech lists, as this allows you to take out units that might be hiding and holding an objective for your opponent that you would not otherwise be able to take out. And as such, this is a very unique model that does see quite a lot of play, as it gives you utility that you would otherwise not have. The other primary weapon option is one that does not see that much play, but it's definitely not a bad option, and that option is the Pharamite Cannon. The Pharamite Cannon has a decent profile of 3 heavy shots at 48 inches with a strength of 8, 3 armor penetration, and 3 damage a shot. And as I said, this is a perfectly fine option, but do consider you have so many different ways of getting similar profiles within the army, especially when you consider that if you take 2 Lascan Iron Striders, they'll only cost you 170 points now, even considering the points increase that we just had. And generally, I'd rather have those 2 Iron Striders than I would a Pharamite Cannon Skorpius Disintegrator, though with that being said, if you're really desperate for those 25 points, there might be a situation where you can take the Pharamite Cannon on your Skorpius Disintegrator as sort of a stand-in for those Iron Striders, as it definitely has a decent enough profile and a decent enough stat line to make it an interesting option. In addition to that, it's also not a blast weapon, meaning you can actually fire it in combat, unlike the Belarus Energy Cannon. A little bit of a silver lining, but nothing special to really write home about. In either case, I think both weapons are decent enough options, but the Belarus can does offer you something unique, and that definitely puts it way ahead. But in either case, the Skorpius Disintegrator is a cheap enough choice points-wise to make it a very interesting model, and one that I would definitely consider for many army lists. There's one last thing to say about the Skorpius Disintegrator, and that is that it explodes on a roll of 6 when it is destroyed, causing D3 mortal wounds against all units within 6 inches. In addition to that, you can force it to explode upon death for 1 command point like all vehicles can, using the Machine Spirit's Revenge, which is a very powerful stratagem that Admech has access to. And with this stratagem, it is possible to use this unit as a screening unit against powerful melee options, as they would be forced to destroy in close combat and take those mortal wounds when you spam that command point. And that's definitely a good trick to have, as all of a sudden you can really change the course of a game if you roll well on that D3 mortal wounds. In any case, I definitely think the Skorpius Disintegrator is here to stay, and it's going to continue seeing play far into the future, as it's definitely a powerful unit, and the nice thing is you can really easily magnetize it, so you can switch it between the Skorpius Dune Rider and the Skorpius Disintegrator, giving you a lot of versatility when you're building your army lists. The Onager Dunecrawler is the second option out of the heavy support choices that the Admech have, and I'll say that the Onager Dunecrawler is one of my favorite models within the army, and one that I think has a really amazing name that has a lot of trivia behind it. If you're interested in learning about the trivia about the Dunecrawler, I'll leave a link down in the description to a video that I made discussing different naming conventions and trivia about the Adeptus Mechanicus forces, as it's a pretty fun one, and the Dunecrawler was definitely a standout part of that video. In any case, the Dunecrawler costs 115 points baseline, which makes it a very cheap option for the Adeptus Mechanicus forces, and with the cheap points cost of the Dunecrawler, I definitely think it's one that's a little bit underrated, as it hasn't seen too much play, but it has shown up in different lists, and one list that I covered within the first episode of the series on the Fringe does feature a heavy amount of Dunecrawlers, which was a very interesting inclusion, as it was a very exciting list. And for those 115 points, the stat line is definitely nothing bad, considering the Dunecrawler has an 8-inch movement, a 3+ ballistic skill that also degrades to 5+, much like the Skorpius Disintegrator. It also has a toughness of 7, 11 wounds, and a 3+ normal save. In addition to that, it has a 5+ invulnerable save, thanks to its Imminatus force field ability, and can get a 4+ feel no pain save against mortal wounds, thanks to that stratagem that it has access to, similar to the Skorpius Disintegrator. All of this makes the Dunecrawler a very tanky option, considering how low it is in points, and it's one that I really like, and that furthers my enjoyment of this unit. In addition to that, the Dunecrawler does have access to Doctrinas, as well as the broad spectrum data tether, as the Skorpius Disintegrator does. It can also choose to replace that data tether with a smoke launcher, which gives it access to the Instance Exhaust stratagem that for 1 command point allows it to give enemies -1 to hit when they're shooting at the Dunecrawler. This is another ability that helps the survivability of the Dunecrawler. And with that being said, it does come with a lot of weapon options as well, giving you the ability to really customize what kind of output the Dunecrawler has. All of the weapon choices keep the Dunecrawler at the same price, unless you buy additional Cognus Heavy Stubbers, which is an option that all of the choices have. If you do buy an additional Cognus Heavy Stubber, it will increase the Dunecrawler's points slightly, bringing up the total points to 120. And in a lot of cases, people have chosen to take the Cognus Stubber, as it's definitely not a bad weapon, giving you 4 assault shots at a strength of 4 and 1 damage, basically being akin to that of a bolter, with an assault profile as opposed to rapid fire. And with that being said, let's take a look at the different special weapon options that the Dunecrawler can have. The most popular of these options is one that was rather bad in 8th edition, being the Twin Onager Heavy Phosphor Blaster, which has a 36-inch range and gives you 8 heavy shots at a strength of 6, 2 armor penetration, and 2 damage a shot, as well as ignoring dense cover benefits of the target that it targets. And this actually puts out quite a lot of firepower, considering it's only 115 points. And in many cases, this can take out quite a lot of mid-range units simply because of how much damage and armor penetration has. The one thing to keep in mind is damage reduction is becoming more common, so that damage of 2 can be a little bit awkward at times and a little bit misleading. Though 6 strength is definitely beyond a breaking point, and 2 armor penetration is enough to put a little bit of a damper on most armor saves out there, as it's pretty much the right amount of armor penetration for mid-range targets. If you happen to not like the Phosphor Blaster, you can go with the Icarus Array, which is actually a combination of 3 different profiles in itself. And each of those profiles have a special rule that this unit gets +1 to hit against aircraft models. It has lost the -1 to hit modifier against normal targets like a U7 8th edition, however it only gains a +1 from targeting aircraft and not flying units. So this has definitely reduced the power level, as you're no longer getting +1 to hit against a large array of different models that happen to have the fly keyword in many different armies. And in addition to that, the recent universal rules changes for aircraft models has definitely reduced the power level of this unit a little bit as well, though I don't think it really changes things one way or the other when considering this weapon system. More so, all 3 profiles of this weapon system have a 48-inch range, but that's where all the similarities end, so let's take a look at each of the systems. The Adeptus missile launcher is the first of these, giving you 1 heavy shot with a strength of 7, 3 armor penetration, and d6 damage. Then comes the twin Icarus autocannon, which gives you 4 shots at a strength of 7, 1 armor penetration, and 2 damage a shot. Finally, you have the Gatling rocket launcher, which has 5 heavy shots at a strength of 6, 2 armor penetration, and 1 damage. In total, this means you get 10 shots at different strength profiles, armor penetration, and damage characteristics. This definitely gives you more shots than the heavy phosphor blaster, but the different inconsistencies in the shots can definitely make it a little bit awkward at times, as you can end up being all over the place, and sometimes you might not be able to get the right combination of armor penetration and damage to really take out the target that you wish to take out. With that being said, there is something to be said about volume, and there's definitely a lot of benefit to considering the Icarus array over the heavy phosphor blasters. In either case, that's a choice you have to make depending on your list and what you expect to see across from you on the tabletop, as sometimes the amount of aircraft you play against definitely influences this decision, so there is a lot of space to play around with the weapon choices of the Dunecrawler. The third weapon system is one that was very popular and still sees some play even to this day, that being the neutron laser. The neutron laser has a 48-inch range with D3 heavy shots, meaning that on average you're going to be getting 2 shots out of this weapon. And for those shots you'll have a strength of 12, 4 armor penetration, and D3 plus 3 damage. And this weapon has the blast keyword, meaning you can't fire it within close combat, but against units of 6 or more you do get the benefits of having all 3 shots. That being said, I don't think there's going to be that many situations where you're going to be shooting this weapon at larger squads, as this is more intended to shoot at bigger and more armored targets. And personally, while I know some people are fans of this weapon, I'm definitely not a fan of it, as I don't like the low number of shots that it has, as well as I do think that the Iron Shredders are generally going to put out more damage and more consistently than this will. However, once again, at the low points cost of the Dunecrawler, I do think this is an option that you can include in your list if you just want a really heavy hitting weapon at a low points cost and have already included all of the Iron Shredders that you can, or simply don't have the points to include more. And in that case, it's definitely a very durable model that can do some damage, and it's not a bad choice by any means. And I should mention that this neutron laser comes with one additional Cognis heavy stubber, which does give it some ability to shoot within close combat, as otherwise it's kind of stuck there. Though with that being said, the Cognis heavy stubber is not that interesting, but you can take up to 2 of them, which can help dealing with some swarms in some situations. The fourth and final option for the Dunecrawler weapon systems is the Eradication Beamer. The Eradication Beamer in itself has 2 different profile options that you can choose from whenever shooting. The Focus profile has an 18-inch range, heavy D6 shots, and a strength of 8, as well as 4 armor penetration and 3 damage a shot. This is definitely an okay profile, and potentially can rival the neutron laser. However, the 18-inch range is definitely a bit of a downside. The Dissipated profile, on the other hand, has a 36-inch range, which is double that of 18 inches, with heavy D6 shots, 8 strength, 3 armor penetration, and 2 damage. And I should mention, this profile has the blast keyword, as does the Focus profile, so once again you can't fire these within close combat, and there's no Cognis heavy stubber that comes with this weapon option as it does with the neutron laser, so at most you're going to only have 1 to help you out with getting out of combat. In both cases, I don't think the profile is impressive enough, and I do think it has its own issues, so I definitely would probably choose one of the other 3 before I choose this one. Though if you want something a little bit lighter than the neutron laser, and you want some more shots at a bit of a higher strength profile, this might be something you consider, but on the other hand, I'd just rather take a phosphor blaster and get 8 shots as opposed to variable D6 shots, which can easily generate a very small number of shots for not much of a benefit. And with those choices being covered, I do think the Dunecrawler is a very interesting choice that the Admech have access to, as it's a very low cost option that can do quite a lot of damage. In addition to that, it does have a very large base size, so it can actually sit on objectives and easily prevent enemies from deep striking too close to them. Or if you so desire, you can put the Dunecrawler in such a position to make it very difficult for your opponents to deep strike, and you can also screen with it rather well due to that large base size. And as such, I do think there's a lot of tricky ways of playing the Dunecrawler that people might not expect, because it's more than just a weapons platform, it's also one that's rather durable and rather large that gives you a few extra tricks that you can pull with this unit when playing your games. The third heavy support choice that the Admech have access to is the Kastelan Robots. The Kastelan Robots used to be more popular but have fallen off a bit going into 9th edition due to the changes in some of their abilities as well as the changes to Belisarius' Call. However, in the recent rules update, the Kastelan Robots did see a bit of a points increase, going down to 90 points per Kastelan before any upgrades, which definitely made them a little better, and that's always a good thing considering they weren't seeing too much play, though they did see some minor play in the beginning when the 9th edition Codex came out, and each squad of Kastelans contains between 2 to 6 Kastelan Robots. And for those 90 points, the stat line is actually rather reasonable, as each Kastelan robot has an 8-inch movement speed, which is not a particularly slow movement speed, and they have a toughness of 7, as well as 7 wounds per model, as well as having a 3+ normal save and a 5+ invulnerable save thanks to the repulsor grid. And the repulsor grid has one other ability, which says if an invulnerable save is made using the repulsor grid, an unmodified 6 on the repulsor grid reflects 1 range attack, dealing 1 mortal wound to attacker, which definitely is a nice benefit, as sometimes you'll generate quite a few mortal wounds, dealing a lot of damage back to your attackers when they're not really expecting it, and as such, you can definitely get a little bit of value there, especially considering how durable these robots can be. And finally, they also have access to that Feel No Pain stratagem that all vehicles within the Admech have access to, and that definitely helps against psychic powers, as well as a few other pesky things that might come your way and bypass that nice invulnerable save. They do only have a 4+ weapon and ballistic skill, which does make their accuracy a little bit lacking, but they do have some ways of making up for it. And for weapons, each Kastelan comes with a primary weapon system and a secondary weapon system. The primary weapon system is a choice between melee fists and ranged Kastelan phosphor blasters, and for these choices you can either pick one of each or pick 2 of one of these choices. However, usually you're going to be picking one of each, as each one gives you a little bit of a different benefit. Let's take a look at the Kastelan Fists first, which gives the Kastelan Robots plus 4 additional strength, bringing them up to a total of 10 strength, with 3 armor penetration and 3 damage a hit. Each of these fists also gives the Kastelan 1 additional melee attack, and if you take only one of these fists, you get a total of 4 melee attacks when making attacks with the Kastelan Robots. That's definitely a decent number of attacks, considering you have 2 robots and you're going to be making 8 attacks with that rather impressive profile included. As for the range weapon, the Kastelan Phosphor Blaster isn't particularly bad either, but does increase the points cost of the Kastelan Robots by a small amount, making each robot cost 95 points if you take one of these Phosphor Blasters on them and 1 fist. This Phosphor Blaster has a 24-inch range, 3 heavy shots, 6 strength, 1 armor penetration, and 2 damage, as well as ignoring enemy dense cover benefits, as all Phosphor weapons do. Normally what you do is you take one of each of these on the Kastelan Robots, as that gives you the most benefits, but there might be some situations where you take 2 of one of these, and we'll take a look at that idea of taking 2 of the Phosphor Blasters after we take a look at the secondary weapon choices. For the secondary weapon choices, you have 2 different options, and you can pick one of those options to equip your Kastelan Robots with. The first of those options is a heavy Phosphor Blaster, which has a 36-inch range, 3 heavy shots, a strength of 6, 2 armor penetration, and 1 damage, as well as ignoring dense cover. This is an interesting option, but generally you're going to go with the other option, which is the Incendiine Combustor. This is a flamer-style weapon that automatically hits, as all flamers do, and has a 12-inch range, as well as heavy D6 shots, with a strength of 5, 2 armor penetration, and 1 damage per wound. This is generally the better choice, considering you're usually also taking 1 fist and 1 Kastelan Phosphor Blaster on each of your robots. As such, this gives you more damage output on average than the heavy Phosphor Blaster that you can mount in the secondary system. However, do consider the following: if you take 2 Kastelan Phosphor Blasters and then a single heavy Phosphor Blaster, each of your Kastelan Robots is going to cost 100 points and have a total of 9 shots with a strength of 6, but 6 of those shots will have 1 armor penetration and 2 damage, while 3 of those shots have 2 armor penetration and 1 damage. And you're also going to be restricted to 24 inches of range, which can be a little awkward at times, though that profile does compare interestingly to an Onager Dunecrawler armed with a heavy Phosphor Blaster, for which costs 115 points and has 8 shots at that longer range and more consistent profile, though the robots do bring their own benefits to the table in comparison to the Dunecrawler. As such, I definitely think there's more room for the robots, but having to take 2 of them within a squad at the minimum does make it a little bit awkward, and there are other things that come into play within that decision. The Kastelan Robots also have a few special abilities, the first of those abilities being Battle Protocols. The Battle Protocols give you 3 different abilities to choose from, and only one of those abilities is active at any given time, giving your Kastelan Robots a little bit of a buff. So let's take a look at these 3 different abilities. The first of these 3 protocols is called the Aegis Protocol, and this is the protocol that the Kastelan Robots start the game in. And what this protocol does is it just increases the 3+ armor save to a 2+ armor save, which is a nice benefit to have, and does make the Kastelan Robots a little more durable than they would be otherwise. It's also the most generically good one, so it's generally going to be the one that you keep the robots in. As for the second protocol, it is the Conqueror's Protocol, and this protocol says that you can reroll charge rolls that this unit makes, as well as their weapon skill going up to 2+. This is definitely a decent enough option, and can be one that you switch into when you're ready to make a charge move and go into melee combat, as going up to a 2+ weapon skill is definitely a big improvement from their natural 4+ weapon skill. The third protocol is the one that has seen the most changes going into 9th edition. This protocol is the Protector Protocol, and when it's activated, their ballistic skill goes up to 3+, but the Kastelans cannot move when they're within this protocol. This one actually used to do something a lot more impressive, where it gave them double the number of shots, but they couldn't move while it was active. Now, however, it just gives them +1 ballistic skill and reduces their mobility to 0. This doesn't really make sense, and I think they should have just dropped the part where it says they can't move, as it would have at least made it a choice you could pick from. But as it stands now, there's pretty much no scenario in which you're going to activate this protocol, and that's one of the big reasons why the Kastelans haven't seen a lot of play, as all of a sudden their points cost is still rather high, but they couldn't make 18 shots per robot like they used to be able to in the past. Instead, they only get +1 ballistic skill now, which is a rather big trade-off to make for the loss of their mobility. Not only that, but it's not the easiest thing to change the protocols that these robots go into. There are 2 different ways to change the protocols. The first way being using a data smith, which is a bit of a clunky option, and a rather slow one, which isn't something you really want to be doing. And the second option of changing the protocols is by using a stratagem known as binary override, which lets you change the protocols instantly for the cost of 1 command point. However, the stratagem is only usable once per game, and if you use the stratagem to change the protocols, you can't change the protocols for the rest of the game. This means when you do make that change, you have to plan to keep them within that protocol state for the rest of the game. And in the past, you basically position your robots, use it to activate their double shooting profile, and go to town. However, now it is a lot less powerful, and usually what you're going to do is you're going to use the stratagem to put them into the Conqueror's protocol after teleporting them, so you can more consistently complete a charge roll from 9 inches away, which can be rather good. And if you're wondering how you teleport these robots, you can utilize the solar flare option within the Lucius Forge world. This relic does require them to have the core keyword. However, if you have a data smith on the table within 3 inches of a unit of Kastelans, they do gain the core keyword, and giving them access to quite a few different stratagems, as well as the ability to be teleported with the solar flare. However, because they have to be within range of a different unit to gain the core keyword, they do have to be on the tabletop, and as such cannot use any stratagems that require the core keyword before the game starts, meaning you can't teleport them into the game using the Lucius stratagem, for example, so you're pretty much stuck using the solar flare. And to wrap up the robots, let's take a look at the different stratagems that the robots have access to, with the first one being Machine Spirit's Revenge, as they can explode when they are destroyed, giving you the ability to deal some mortal wounds. However, do keep in mind, because you do bring them in a unit, sometimes they start exploding while other robots are alive, or something like the data smith is nearby, causing them to start a chain reaction where they continuously damage themselves, which can be a rather big liability in a lot of situations. In addition to the ability to automatically explode, they do have access to 2 different melee stratagems that are pretty interesting. The first of those stratagems being Crushing Weight, which allows you to select a unit of Kastelan Robots that have successfully completed a charge movement within this phase, and then you roll a d6 for each model in that unit of Kastelan Robots, dealing 1 mortal wound to an enemy unit within engagement range for each roll of 2+. This isn't something particularly amazing, but it does only cost 1 command point. And if you have a unit of 3 or more Kastelan Robots, charging an enemy unit, that's quite a lot of mortal wounds that they can generate, and that can really swing a melee combat phase, so it's definitely something you should keep in mind, because on average generating 3 or more mortal wounds is definitely something that's worth that 1 command point. And finally, they have access to the stratagem known as Electroshock, which we've covered in the Elite's video. But what the stratagem does is it allows you to spend 1 command point to select 1 enemy unit that isn't a monster or a vehicle within engagement range of a Adeptus Mechanicus core unit, and the selected unit fights last. And this once again helps the melee capabilities of the Kastelan Robots, but do keep in mind that the data smith has to be present, otherwise they are not a core unit and will not have access to a stratagem. However, when they do have access to a stratagem, something you should really make good use of, considering that they have a lot of power within melee and can crush enemies before that enemy ever gets a chance to counterattack. Though having vehicles and monsters as a restriction is definitely a lot more brutal for the Kastelan Robots than it is for the Electro Priests, considering the strength profile of the Kastelan Robots. In either case, I do think the Kastelan Robots have a place in the game, as they can do a lot of damage, as well as being a decent enough shooting threat and a really good melee threat. What I really think made the Kastelan Robots unplayable for a long time was simply their points cost, considering they do a little bit of everything, but they don't do anything especially well, which makes them a little bit awkward considering that you have to take multiple of them, and as such the points add up rather quickly. However, at this points cost, I do think they're interesting, and if the points cost keeps going down, at some point they're just going to be good enough that you're pretty much going to start including them in the majority of lists. And with that being said, which heavy support choice is your favorite? I really like the model for all 3 of them. However, if I had to choose which one I like the most in terms of looks, and not just simple game power, I would say it's probably the Onager Dunecrawler, followed by the Kastelan Robots and the Skorpius Disintegrator in last place, simply because I'm not the biggest fan of that specific model. In any case, let me know what you think, and as always, if you've enjoyed the content, like and subscribe, as it really does help the channel out, and if you get the opportunity, please do share the channel, as that not only massively helps the channel, but also helps the people who may discover it and benefit from the content. I would also like to give a quick shout out to my patrons. You guys are awesome people. Thank you very much for supporting the channel, and regardless if you're a patron or not, thank you for watching and have a great day.